At anchor, her long, narrow hull, riding light on the tide, the Adventure Galley was a ship built for speed, not comfort. Her oars rested along her flanks like folded wings, ready to spring into action. She wasn't a typical merchant ship or a man of war, but a hybrid, a predator designed to chase down prey whether the wind blew or not. When William Kidd first stepped onto her deck as commander, the ship's promise seemed to mirror his own. He was already a seasoned mariner, respected in many ports, and trusted by powerful men. They'd given him a commission, a piece of paper that could make him rich and respectable in a single voyage. That ink on the commission was as important as the iron of his cannons. It was a paper shield, meant to draw a clear line between lawful privateering and the dark stain of piracy. But the sea has a way of blurring those lines once you lose sight of land. Kidd's authority came from two places: the king's blessing and the mountain of expectations placed upon him. His investors wanted a massive profit. Government officials wanted England's enemies harassed without the trouble of an open war. Merchants wanted protection from pirates, and Kidd himself, he wanted to rise, to prove he was more than just a capable captain. He wanted to join the ranks of men who forged their own fortunes. The Adventure Galley was the instrument of that ambition, and her deck was the stage where Kidd would try to balance duty, greed, and survival. The crew he inherited was a rough mix of nationalities and loyalties. They were men drawn by rumors of great wealth as much as by promised wages. Some believed the commission made everything legal and clean. Others couldn't care less what was written on parchment. They knew cannon smoke smelled the same whether it was fired in the king's name or their own. Kidd understood this tension from day one. Discipline would be his anchor. He enforced the rules with an iron fist, knowing that a single crack in his authority could quickly spiral into mutiny. But he also had to keep his men hopeful, and on a ship like the Adventure Galley, hope was measured in one thing: prize money. As the ship prepared to set sail, the docks buzzed with gossip. Other captains whispered about Kidd's powerful backers and the strange design of his vessel. Some were jealous. Others suspected that any man given so much freedom would eventually cross the line. Kidd never heard these whispers directly, but he felt their pressure all the same. Every order he gave was weighed against how it might be interpreted later, in a distant courtroom, by men who had never felt a deck roll beneath their feet. This constant worry sharpened his caution, but it also fueled his frustration. Once underway, the Adventure Galley revealed her true nature. She was a marvel. She could outrun bulky merchant ships and, using her oars, slip through dead calms, closing relentlessly on her target. Kidd took immense pride in how she handled. He'd often paced the deck himself, adjusting course, feeling how she answered the helm. In those early days, his confidence was solid. The sea was his home, and command felt natural. He was a man of few words but high expectations, and for a while, the crew responded. They were professionals, and professionalism can mask doubt, especially when the promise of money still feels close. But even in that initial stretch, cracks began to form. They'd encounter potential prizes, but hesitation would follow. Flags were studied too carefully. Ships' papers were examined for far too long. Kidd's commission was specific: he could only seize certain ships under certain conditions. But the world at sea is a messy, gray area that demands instant judgment. Every time Kidd decided to let a vessel pass, it gnawed at the crew's patience. They hadn't signed on to watch sails disappear over the horizon. They wanted action, and action meant risk. Kidd felt their simmering frustration like a physical weight. At night, in the quiet of his cabin, he would replay his choices over and over. One unlawful seizure could destroy the very legitimacy he depended on, but one too many cautious decisions could turn his own crew against him. He knew the stories of captains who lost control, not because they were weak, but because they hesitated when the moment demanded a decisive hand. The Adventure Galley, for all her speed, couldn't outrun the growing discontent on her own decks. The ocean itself seemed completely indifferent to these human dramas. The days blurred into a routine of watches, meals of salted meat and hardtack, and the endless maintenance required to keep a wooden ship alive. Kidd made his rounds, speaking just enough to be seen, to be known, but never enough to become familiar. Familiarity, he knew, bred contempt and challenged authority. Still, he listened. Sailors always talk, and what they talk about matters. He heard them speaking of other captains, striking it rich, captains who cared less about the fine print on a piece of paper. These weren't direct accusations, but comparisons. And comparisons, on a long voyage, can be corrosive, eating away at morale like salt on iron. Despite this, there were moments when Kidd's vision felt entirely justified. When the Adventure Galley surged forward on a fresh wind, her sails full, or when the guns were run out for drills and the crew moved with practiced, deadly efficiency, he could almost see success as inevitable. He told himself that patience was a virtue, that lawful profit was slower but far safer. His commission promised a legitimate return home, not as a hunted criminal, but as a respected gentleman. That promise was his anchor in the storm of doubt. But what Kidd didn't yet know, what he couldn't possibly know, was how fragile that promise truly was. He didn't know how little patience history has for men caught in the gray areas, men trapped between categories. The Adventure Galley was carrying more than just cannons and crew. She was carrying a cargo of conflicting expectations that could never all be met. With every league sailed, the knot of his predicament tightened. Every missed opportunity made the next decision heavier, the stakes higher. Command, Kid was learning, wasn't just about giving orders, it was about absorbing pressure. It was about standing firm until that pressure either forged you into something stronger or caused you to collapse entirely. As his ship pressed onward, the vast empty sea widening around them, Kid stood at the rail and stared at the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond his sight, lay the prizes that would justify this entire voyage. Somewhere out there was the success that would silence all the doubt, both from his crew and from within himself. For now, the Adventure Galley moved smoothly through the water. A silent redditor with an unwritten future, her captain still believing that skill, and caution, and honor could be balanced just long enough to bring him safely home. As the Adventure Galley sailed farther from familiar shores, the lines of Captain Kidd's mission began to blur. Distance has a way of doing that, stretching rules until they're almost transparent. The ship navigated waters teeming with both treasure and trouble, from bustling trade routes to desolate stretches where storms held sway. Every sail on the horizon triggered a tense ritual. Flags were scrutinized, holes identified, and a decision made: intercept or evade. Kid was the heart of every choice, his silent demeanor often masking a storm of uncertainty within. The initial chases ended in nothing but frustration. Potential targets would turn out to be neutral ships or inconveniently protected by powerful escorts. Just as they closed in, official documents would appear, seals unbroken, allegiances clearly stated, forcing Kid to back down. Time and again, he let them go, convincing himself that this restraint would eventually pay off. But the crew saw things differently. They weren't counting on future dividends. They were counting empty days and shares they hadn't earned. Whispers began to circulate, tales of other captains who seized what they wanted and dealt with the legalities later. No one confronted Kid directly, but the mood soured. The laughter on deck grew louder, sharper, laced with a growing impatience. The Adventure Galley herself seemed to feel the strain of the fruitless pursuits. Oars splintered, ropes frayed, and, just like the ship's rigging, the men's tempers wore thin. Kid's response was to tighten his grip. He believed order could stand in for fortune until fortune decided to show up. He doubled the watches, enforced strict cleanliness, and punished even minor infractions without hesitation. To him, this was about maintaining control. To some of the crew, it was proof their captain cared more for appearances than fulfilling their pockets. When they finally did capture a few prizes, they were meager, barely worth the gunpowder they'd spent. Still, Kid took them, clinging to the idea that a growing list of legal captures would eventually impress his powerful investors back home. The crew, however, only saw the glaring imbalance between the risks they were taking and the pathetic rewards. They began to question not just Kid's luck, but his very judgment. A captain's authority is built on belief, and that belief was quietly eroding. Even stopping in port offered no respite. In harbors buzzing with gossip and intrigue, Kid found only suspicion. News of his failures had traveled faster than his ship. Officials would pore over his papers with exaggerated thoroughness, while merchants watched his every move with narrowed, distrustful eyes. Each delay cost him precious money and, more importantly, morale. Kid felt trapped, squeezed between expectations he couldn't possibly meet. His investors demanded results. The authorities demanded restraint, and his crew, they just wanted their treasure. The sea, vast and indifferent, offered no answers. In response, Kid became more aggressive. The Adventure Galley began to hunt with a new ferocity, finally putting her incredible speed to use. When the wind died down, the men would row, their muscles straining as the ship inched closer to its quarry. These moments were electric, the tension a palpable hum across the deck. Victory felt so close, almost inevitable. And then, it would vanish. A target would slip into neutral waters or reveal an affiliation that made attacking them far too dangerous. Each near miss left the crew more volatile than before. The captain's isolation deepened. Conversations would die down the moment he approached the deck. His officers reported obedience, but he could sense their loyalties were divided. He trusted almost no one, knowing how desperation can turn good men into reckless ones. At night, the creaking timbers of the ship sounded like whispers of accusation. He would lie awake, replaying every decision, wondering if one bolder choice, one different turn, could have changed everything. The line he walked between a lawful privateer and an outlaw pirate grew thinner with every passing week. Storms brought temporary relief. When the weather turned violent, fear had a way of reminding everyone who was in charge. In the face of raging seas, Kid was a master of his craft, barking orders that kept the ship and its crew alive. In those moments of shared survival, the men remembered why he was their captain. Unity was forged in the heart of the tempest. But as soon as the skies cleared and the seas calmed, the old resentments would resurface, even sharper than before. Talk on the deck turned increasingly to legends. Sailors would trade embellished stories of other pirates, men who ignored their commissions and made their fortunes in a single audacious raid. These tales were like a currency of discontent, fueling the crew's dissatisfaction. Kid heard them too. Publicly he dismissed them as fantasy, but privately, they ate at him. He knew the stories were exaggerated, but he also knew that exaggeration often contains a kernel of truth. The sea, it seemed, rewarded boldness, not caution. As the weeks bled into months, the Adventure Galley became a floating contradiction. It was a ship built for decisive, brutal action, yet commanded by a man trapped in hesitation. His attempts to hold the moral high ground felt increasingly hollow, even to himself. Every lawful decision he made came at the cost of his crew's trust. He began to feel that the end of this voyage, whatever it might be, would not be the triumph he had once dreamed of. Encounters at sea grew more dangerous. It became harder to prove neutrality. Other ships saw the Adventure Galley fast, heavily armed, and flying a British flag in hostile waters, and immediately viewed her with suspicion. A single miscalculation could provoke a fight they couldn't win. Kidd found himself arming his men for conflicts he was desperately trying to avoid, leading a crew who no longer believed in his mission. The irony was bitter. He had set out to operate within the law, but now, the law offered him no protection at all. By the time the ship pushed into the farthest reaches of the Indian Ocean, morale was a fragile thing, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. Kidd could feel mutiny in the air. It wasn't a specific plot, but an idea, a possibility that lingered at the edge of every quiet conversation. He fought it with what little authority he had left, but resolve without reward is a difficult thing to sustain. The Adventure Galley still sliced through the waves with deadly grace, but the essential harmony between captain, crew, and purpose had fractured. Somewhere on the horizon, waited opportunities that could either redeem everything or destroy what little remained. Kidd didn't know which it would be. He only knew that turning back was no longer an option. The voyage had taken on a life of its own, dragging him relentlessly forward. With every league sailed, the grip of expectation and desperation tightened. The Adventure Galley hunted on, her captain bound to a course shaped by rumor and fear, chasing a fortune across the globe while the true cost of the chase silently mounted with every passing day. The stories began quietly, as most dangerous ideas do, folded into late-night conversations and half-remembered tales swapped between watchers. Sailors, by their very nature, are collectors of rumor, and the sea itself seems to carry memory in its currents. Somewhere along the long arc of their voyage, whispers of a Spanish treasure ship, lost to catastrophe, began to surface more frequently. Told with increasing confidence, it was said to have gone down in a storm of biblical fury, torn apart on unseen reefs, its cargo scattered and swallowed by the sea. Gold, silver, emeralds, a fortune so vast it defied accounting. A ship erased in a single night, leaving behind nothing but ghosts and unanswered questions. To Captain Kidd, these stories initially registered as a mere distraction. He had heard dozens like them over the years, each promising unimaginable riches just beyond reach. Most were fantasies, inflated by distance and desire. Yet this one lingered. The details were too specific, the conviction too shared among the crew. Sailors spoke of the hurricane that had crushed an entire fleet, of survivors clinging to wreckage before vanishing into the dark. They spoke of how recovery efforts had failed, how the sea had guarded its prize so jealously. The wreck had become a legend precisely because it resisted retrieval, a powerful symbol of fortune denied. The idea took root in Kidd's mind not because he believed he could simply stumble upon such treasure, but because the story reframed his own struggle. Here was proof, sailors said, that immense wealth could vanish without being claimed, that the sea held riches beyond the reach of kings and courts. The implication was subtle but powerful. Legitimacy was fragile, and fortune favored those willing to seize opportunity when it appeared. Kidd didn't voice his agreement, but he started listening more closely than before. As the Adventure Galley pressed onward, the legend of the lost treasure began to shape decisions indirectly. Crew members now speculated openly, their mounting frustration finding an outlet in dreams of a sudden reversal of fortune. If such a ship could be found, everything would change. Debts would vanish, doubt would evaporate, Kidd's failures would be forgotten, replaced by triumph. Even the law itself might bend in the face of such overwhelming success. These were not arguments, exactly, but hopes dressed up as inevitability. Kidd felt the weight of these expectations keenly. He knew the story's power lay not in its truth, but in what it represented. The lost treasure was a mirror held up to his own predicament of fortune, tantalizingly close in imagination, but maddeningly distant in reality. It suggested that the sea itself might offer absolution, that wealth recovered from oblivion carried a different moral weight than wealth taken from living men. This rationalization crept into his thoughts quietly, uninvited, but it was persistent. He began to consider how history judged such acts. Salvage, after all, was not piracy. Recovering what the sea had already claimed could be framed as a rescue, not theft. The distinction mattered deeply to Kidd, even as it blurred under scrutiny. He told himself that dreaming of such treasure was harmless, just a way to keep spirits alive. Yet he noticed how often his own thoughts returned to the idea, how it colored his assessment of risk and reward. The crew's fixation intensified. The legend of the wreck became shorthand for hope itself. When days passed without a prize, someone would mention it. When tempers flared, another would remind the others that the sea still held its secrets. Kidd's authority was now completely entwined with this myth. He hadn't promised anything, but the mere fact that he didn't dismiss the story outright allowed it to flourish. His silence became complicity. This shift affected the entire culture of the ship. Discipline loosened in subtle ways, not through open defiance but through altered priorities. Men talked less about their shares from lawful captures and more about a singular, transformative fortune. The Adventure Galley, once a tool of calculated pursuit, began to feel like a vessel of pure possibility, its course guided as much by imagination as by any chart. Kid sensed this change but struggled to counter it without crushing morale entirely. He tried to reassert focus, reminding his officers that their mission remained unchanged. Yet even as he spoke the words, he felt their hollowness. The sea had offered him very little reward for his caution. The legend, on the other hand, offered at least the illusion of purpose. It suggested that perseverance might yet be justified, that all their suffering would be redeemed by one great discovery. Kid was not immune to that hope. He was, after all, a man whose reputation now hung on outcomes rather than intentions. The irony was not lost on him. The treasure ship's destruction had been sudden, indiscriminate, a reminder of how quickly fortune could turn. Yet the story was retold not as a warning, but as a promise. The hurricane became a gatekeeper, the reef a veil. What lay beneath was pure potential, untouched by human compromise. Kid wondered whether this was how pirates were born, not through cruelty or greed alone, but through the gradual erosion of faith in orderly reward. As the weeks passed, the lost treasure became a benchmark against which all other opportunities were judged. Small prizes now felt insulting by comparison. Lawful captures seemed petty. The scale had shifted, and with it, the crew's patience. Kid found himself trapped by a narrative he had not authored but now embodied. He was either the captain who might lead them to something extraordinary, or the man who would deny them that chance. The sea offered no guidance, only relentless movement. Its currents carried the Adventure Galley onward, indifferent to the stories being told upon her deck. Kid stood watch more often now, staring into the darkness as if answers might rise from it. He thought of the wrecked ship, broken and scattered, its wealth lying unseen for generations. He thought of how history remembered men not for their caution, but for their daring. These thoughts unsettled him, not because they were persuasive, but because they felt increasingly reasonable. The legend had done its work. It had reframed failure as proximity, and delay as destiny. Kid did not yet act on this shift, but his decisions grew heavier. Each one weighed against the possibility that something greater lay just beyond his grasp. The Adventure Galley sailed on, carrying not only men and cannon, but a story that had begun to shape reality. Somewhere beneath the waves, a wreck slept undisturbed, unaware that its long shadow had reached across time to influence a captain wrestling with his own unraveling resolve. On the vast, unforgiving ocean, pressure doesn't just build, it seeks a target. For Captain Kidd and his crew aboard the Adventure Galley, that pressure settled into the tight, airless space between them. It hardened into resentment, a bitter substance that no amount of discipline could ever dissolve. The ship, once a vessel of hope, had become a ship of grievances. Every order from Kidd was met with silent questioning. Every missed opportunity tallied like an unpaid debt. The legend of lost Spanish gold still hung over them, a shimmering mirage on the horizon, but its meaning had soured. It was no longer just a dream of salvation, it was now an accusation. If such incredible fortune truly existed in the world, then why were they still so hungry, so desperate? Kidd reacted the only way he knew how. He tightened his grip. He believed, perhaps desperately, that if he enforced his authority with enough force, he could restore their shattered confidence. He punished insubordination swiftly, and sometimes, with brutal harshness. Minor infractions were magnified and used as public examples. A sailor late for his watch would feel the full weight of the captain's displeasure, as if he had committed treason. To Kidd, this was a grim necessity. But to the crew, it felt like misdirected anger. They saw a captain lashing out at them simply because the sea had refused him his prize. The breaking point didn't come with the thunder of cannon fire or a desperate chase. It arrived in a confrontation that spiraled tragically out of control. Tempers, once hidden in whispers, now flared openly on the deck. One of Kidd's officers, long resentful and feeling emboldened by the crew's dark mood, challenged the captain's judgment outright. The words they exchanged were sharp, public, and cut through the fragile illusion of unity that every command depends upon. The entire deck fell silent as the argument escalated. Every man watching knew that something irreversible was happening. Kidd's response was swift, fueled as much by exhaustion and fear as it was by rage. He struck the man down. It was an act meant to reassert his dominance, but it was carried out with lethal force. The officer died soon after, not in battle, not as part of a mutiny, but from a single moment when a captain's authority curdled into deadly violence. The sea, as always, was indifferent. The ship sailed on, that everything and everyone aboard her had changed. The death sent a shockwave through the crew that discipline alone could no longer contain. Some were horrified, others were quietly satisfied, but all of them understood the chilling implication. A sacred line had been crossed. Kidd's authority, once grounded in his royal commission and his proven competence, was now forever stained by blood that was spilled without an enemy in sight. This violent act didn't restore order, it twisted it into something new and terrible. Obedience became brittle, enforced by raw fear rather than genuine respect. Kidd himself seemed altered in the aftermath. He withdrew into himself, speaking less, trusting fewer people. The immense weight of what he had done pressed down on him. Though he would never admit it openly, he tried to justify the act as necessary, as the unavoidable cost of command under impossible circumstances. But even to him, the justifications rang hollow. The line between a lawful privateer and something much, much darker had been blurred beyond repair. From that moment on, Kidd's reputation aboard the Adventure Galley began to outrun him. The men watched him differently, more carefully, interpreting every gesture as a potential threat. Conversations would halt the moment he approached, not out of deference anymore, but out of caution. The ship felt haunted, not by ghosts from the sea, but by the unspoken recognition that their captain was no longer protected by the moral certainty he once clung to. Ironically, the very act meant to preserve order only accelerated its decay. Some crew members began to imagine alternatives. They weren't plotting a full-scale mutiny, but they were thinking of escape, desertion, anything for survival on their own terms. Loyalty, once the bedrock of a ship, thinned and was replaced by cold calculation. Kidd sensed this shift, and he responded with more control, more rules, more distance. But each new measure only pushed the crew further away from him, widening the gap until it felt completely unbridgeable. The Adventure Galley continued to hunt, but now her pursuits carried a sharper, more desperate edge. Kidd seized prizes with less and less hesitation. His earlier caution gave way to a frantic urgency. The legality of his actions became secondary to sheer necessity. He told himself that success would justify everything. He believed that one single, decisive victory could erase the doubt, silence his critics, and maybe even absolve him of the violence. This belief drove him harder, faster, into ever riskier waters, yet fortune remained stubbornly elusive. Each capture brought more complications instead of relief. Neutral nations protested his seizures. His legal papers were questioned at every port, and word was spreading, carried by sailors and merchants from one end of the ocean to the other. Kidd was no longer just a privateer struggling for success. He was becoming a problem, a man whose actions invited intense scrutiny from all sides. The royal commission that had once shielded him now felt terrifyingly fragile, something that could be revoked at any moment. The crew felt this growing danger too. They understood, perhaps even more clearly than Kidd, that their captain was running out of room to maneuver. Fear had completely replaced hope. The shining legend of lost treasure faded, overshadowed by the very real and growing threat of the hangman's noose. The men stopped thinking about riches and started thinking only about how to survive what was coming. As the tension mounted, the ship itself seemed to absorb it. The creak of the timbers sounded louder in the night. The snap of the sails and the wind sounded sharper. The sea, once a vast canvas for their ambition, now felt like a narrowing corridor, closing in on them. And at its center stood Captain Kidd, increasingly alone. A man trapped by a series of decisions that, while perhaps defensible on their own, had added up to a catastrophe. By the time the Adventure Galley turned toward what would become her final, infamous act in history, the outcome felt less like a matter of fate and more like unstoppable momentum. Kidd's dark legacy was already taking shape, written not in the logs of treasure chests, but in the fearful whispers and damning reports that followed him across the globe. He had never set out to become infamous. But infamy has a way of attaching itself to men who linger too long between roles, who mistake brute control for redemption. The murder aboard the ship didn't end the voyage, but it ended any illusion that it could ever conclude cleanly. From that moment forward, every new horizon carried the threat of judgment with it, and every port became a potential trap. The Adventure Galley sailed on, but she did so under a deep shadow, one cast not by storm clouds or enemy sails, but by the irreversible truth that her captain's name was now bound to fear just as much as it was to command. To the end, when it came for Captain Kidd and the Adventure Galley, didn't arrive with a thunderous storm or a final, spectacular battle. There was no single, dramatic moment to mirror the sinking of the Spanish treasure ship that had set this whole journey in motion. Instead, it was a slow, quiet tightening of a net, a gradual closing of doors that Kidd felt long before anyone else dared to say it aloud. He could feel it in the ports they visited. The once welcoming officials were now guarded, their politeness stiff and formal. The whispers that followed his name had shifted from curiosity to suspicion. The Adventure Galley herself was weary. She was still a fast and formidable ship, but years of hard use, constant repairs, and dwindling rewards had taken their toll. The wood groaned with exhaustion, and the sails were patched and worn. The crew felt it too. The men who had once dreamed of gold and glory now just counted the days until they could set foot on solid ground. Their loyalty, once a given, now had to be measured against the ever-increasing risk. Kidd watched them, a bitter mix of resentment and regret swirling within him. He believed he'd given them everything: discipline, purpose, survival, but what they truly craved was proof that all their suffering, all their sacrifices, had meant something. They wanted their payday. News, however, traveled faster than the wind. Stories of his questionable seizures, tales of violence on board, and rumors that his royal commission no longer held any real power preceded him everywhere. Kidd sensed the protections he once relied on were evaporating. The very legal ambiguity that had been his shield was now becoming his vulnerability. His allies in high places grew cautious, then silent. The vast distance of the ocean, once his greatest asset, was now his biggest liability. Faced with this grim reality, Kidd made a desperate gamble, a final bet on the system he still believed in. He decided to return. He would sail straight back to the colonies, trusting that he could explain himself, that reason and the letter of the law would see the impossible position he'd been forced into. It was a final wager on his own legitimacy, made by a man who had spent far too long walking the razor's edge. The crew's reaction was mixed. Some were relieved, seeing an end to the endless uncertainty. Others saw it as a surrender, a captain giving up the fight. A few, not willing to face judgment, quietly slipped away at the first opportunity, disappearing into the coastal towns. Kidd let them go. The burden of command was now his and his alone. When he finally left the Adventure Galley behind, whether he abandoned her or simply surrendered her to the tides, she had been his tool, his shield, his excuse for everything. Without her, William Kidd was just a man with a fearsome reputation racing ahead of him. The sea, which once promised infinite possibility, now felt like a cage, its horizons closing in. The reckoning on land was as swift as it was unforgiving. No one was interested in nuance or complicated explanations. The world preferred simple labels, and pirate was a much easier fit than embattled privateer. The evidence against him was filtered through the lens of his failure, not his intent. That precious royal commission, the document that had once felt like an ironclad guarantee, now seemed like a flimsy, forgotten relic. Its authority was drowned out by louder, more sensational narratives of betrayal and greed. Kidd stood and spoke in his own defense. He tried to explain the choices he made under extreme pressure, the decisions shaped by mutinous crews and hostile waters, not by malice. But his words fell on deaf ears, into a silence already filled with a verdict. What truly sealed his fate wasn't the treasure he had or hadn't taken, but the trust he had broken. His powerful backers, the men who had financed his voyage, found it politically convenient to cut him loose. As it so often does, responsibility flowed downhill, finally settling on the shoulders of the man who stood on the quarterdeck and gave the orders. Kidd the man became Kidd the lesson. He was held up as an example, a way for the authorities to draw a clear, hard line between legal enterprise and piracy, a line that had previously been intentionally blurred. And as his fate closed in, the myth began to harden. The complex privateer faded from public memory, replaced by the simple, enduring image of Captain Kidd the bloodthirsty pirate. History, impatient with the machinations of gradual failure, always prefers a decisive villain. The truth of his voyage, scattered like wreckage across the vast ocean, was lost to the waves. The irony is staggering. The lost Spanish treasure, the phantom prize that had haunted his entire journey, remained exactly where it had always been, buried under sand and coral. It would be centuries before its riches were finally recovered, long after Kidd was just a ghost story told to children. The fortune that defined and destroyed his life was never his to find. The Adventure Galley, too, vanished into history. Her timbers slowly reclaimed by the sea, joining the countless other wrecks in the unmarked graveyard of ambition. No monument marks her final resting place. Her only legacy is the name of her captain, and the cautionary tale that name has become. Captain Kidd's story endures because it's not a simple one. He was neither a pure villain nor a misunderstood hero. He was something far more relatable and far more unsettling, a capable man, undone by circumstance, pressure, and a series of small compromises. His downfall wasn't one single catastrophic decision, but 1,000 tiny ones, each made with the belief that there would always be time to correct his course later. But the sea rarely grants such mercy. In the end, the voyage of the Adventure Galley is a timeless reminder of how thin that line is between lawful ambition and lawless greed, between command and coercion, between a celebrated hero and a condemned pirate. Kidd sailed in search of order and profit, trusting that the rules could contain human desire. What he discovered was that the ocean is a place that magnifies uncertainty, and that those who linger too long in its gray, lawless spaces are often consumed not by the truth of what they did but by the stories that are told about them. The sea, as it always does, moves on, carrying new ships, new captains, and new dreams. And beneath the surface, the wrecks sleep, holding their secrets forever. While above, history repeats itself, driven by the same ambition, the same fear, and the same timeless human need to believe that fortune, once glimpsed, can still be seized before it vanishes forever. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the depths of history.